When I was 15 years old, my family and I had moved to California after my dad got a job offer there. The house in the neighborhood was nice, so I didn't really mind the move too much. We had been living there for almost a year, and since moving there, I had managed to make a few new friends in that time. One day I invited my friend Trevor over, and we had spent the evening after school watching Ghost Adventures. Me and Trevor had bonded over our shared interest in weird and creepy stuff like ghosts. As we talked, Trevor asked about the house next to us. I had never paid too much attention to it, as it looked run down and the yard was overgrown. But as we talked about it, I couldn't help but wonder why it seemed to have been abandoned for so many years. I had always had a weird feeling about the house, but it wasn't until that day that I couldn't ignore my curiosity about it. Maybe it was just because we were bored or superstitious after having watched hours of ghost documentaries, but we both wanted to check it out. My parents were coming home soon, so I told Trevor that when he came back tomorrow we could do it then, as I was a little worried that if my parents knew, they'd be upset with me, or that I would get into trouble. The next day arrived, and me and Trevor were excited to check out the house, and although neither of us admitted it at the time, we were both a little scared. I had borrowed my dad's flashlight from the garage so that we could see inside the house, as I was almost 100% positive that there would be no electricity there. We wasted no time and headed to the house. The door was a little rotten, so it was hard to get inside, and just like I had expected, the house was dark and there was this musty smell in the air. There wasn't much in the main level of the house except for some broken and dusty furniture. Trevor had walked to another room, and as I kneeled down to pick up an old postcard on the floor in the kitchen, I heard Trevor calling my name. I found Trevor standing near a closed door. "I think this is the basement," he said. Trevor went down first, and I followed after him. As I walked further down the stairs, I could feel the air getting colder around me. In comparison to the first floor, there was a lot more in the basement to explore. The first thing to catch my eye down there was an old piano, which still played but was very out of tune. We also found a bunch of World War II memorabilia, which seemed odd to me. A lot of the stuff in the basement, like the collectibles and the piano, seemed like they were worth money, so it didn't make sense to me at all that all of this stuff was just abandoned and left behind. As we ventured further into the basement, I saw it. It was a dirty, unmade mattress laying flat on the floor, and for some reason, this seemed to be the weirdest thing that we had found in the house. I couldn't explain why, as there wasn't anything about the mattress to really make me feel that way, but I just had a weird feeling about it, and Trevor did too. We had spent well over an hour combing through the place and hadn't found too much other than just some old dusty junk that had been left behind by whoever had lived there previously. It was starting to get late, and I wanted to get out of there before my parents got home. So we decided to head out, a little bummed out by how uneventful our adventure was. However, as we headed back up the stairs, Trevor froze in front of me. At first I wasn't sure why, but then I heard it. It was soft, but it sounded like someone crying upstairs. We had just been up there, and there was no one else in the house with us. Me and Trevor began to panic, and without hesitation, we darted up the stairs and left the house as quickly as we could. Years later, me and Trevor still haven't forgotten about the house or what happened. But needless to say, we haven't gone exploring any more abandoned homes since then. When I was 10 years old, I was living in a cul-de-sac with my family. I had my own room, while my two younger sisters shared a room. On multiple occasions, my two younger sisters would come into my room late at night to sleep in there with me, after they started complaining that they were seeing strange lights in their room. We had gone to my parents to tell them about it, but they just dismissed it as the street lights outside. I woke up one night with this weird sensation, and when I looked around my dark room, I could see the silhouette of someone standing in the doorway, the small red glow of what looked like a cigarette. Both of my parents smoked, so at first I just assumed that it was one of them. I sat up from under my covers and called out to them, but there was no answer, and just like that, it had disappeared. I was so freaked out that I balled up under my covers, shaking. As I sat there in a ball under my covers, I felt the faint sensation of my covers being tugged. At this point, I was frozen in fear. I don't remember much else, as I fell back asleep soon after that. I woke up the next day, convinced that it was all just a horrible nightmare. But flash forward 10 years, and I still have these kinds of dreams about the house, or at least I'm hoping that they're just dreams. A while back, my mother also admitted that she had similar dreams about the house. None of it makes sense, but it's all terrifying to me. I'm not sure what to think about it, but the most frequent explanation that I can manage to think of is that maybe the house was on some old Indian burial ground and that we had gotten cursed for living there, but I'm not so sure. My mom had worked at a nursing home for over 13 years, and when I got older, I also went on to work at the same one that she did. My time working there was one of the scariest moments in my life. Many of the elderly patients that I cared for there, from those of sound mind to those with more severe conditions like dementia, often talked about a little boy. I had never seen the little boy that the residents spoke of myself, and neither had any of the other staff working there that I had talked to. At first, I wanted to just assume that it was all just some scary coincidence, that so many residents spoke of the little boy as though he was real. But as time went on, I found it harder to do so. One day, I was walking with a resident when they stopped at the elevator doors, refusing to go inside, because they claimed that the boy was in there and that they were scared of him. At first, I just shrugged this off, but then later that day, I had another resident approach me, asking if I had any candy as they wanted to give the little boy some. Freaked out by this, I decided to ask my mom about it. She told me that for as long as she had worked there, she had heard stories about the boy too. She said that residents who saw him described him as having dark hair. Weeks later, I was tending to a resident who had recently had a stroke. As I was helping to feed the resident, I could feel a cold hand touch my arm. Before I even had time to process it, the resident said something that I'll never forget. They had asked me if I knew the boy. I was so shaken by this, knowing that the hand I had felt had been the little boy's that the residents had claimed to see. Later that evening, I heard the news that the resident I was tending to when it happened had passed away. It was then that I knew it was real and not a coincidence like I wanted to believe it was. My mom had always been a pretty religious lady, but she wasn't overly religious, meaning she didn't really read her Bible all that often, or attend services, but she did believe pretty firmly. As a kid, we'd often watch scary movies together, but anytime I suggested a movie that involved anything religious, like possessions or exorcisms, she'd strongly refuse watching it. I had always wondered about it, but I just thought it was because she was religious. One day I jokingly asked my mom if she had wanted to watch The Exorcist with me, and she got really upset about it. She had never reacted that strongly to something before, so I decided to apologize to her and ask her why, because after so long I was genuinely curious. Her answer wasn't all what I expected. She told me that when she was a teenager, she had gone over to a friend's house for a sleepover, and that they had brought out a board game that my mother wasn't familiar with. Turns out that it was a Ouija board. She played along, not expecting much to happen, but the lights went out suddenly. She told me that at the time she just thought it was a coincidence, but after the lights were back on, they decided to resume. As they started to ask the Ouija board questions, my mother claimed that she felt a cold breeze go across her and swore that she could see the reflection of something next to her in her TV. As my mother retold this story, I could tell how much it had affected her, and suddenly her refusal to watch those kinds of films began to make sense to me. When I was 13, my parents left me alone for the weekend. I was sleeping in their bedroom, as their room had a much nicer TV. I was up at 2 a.m. watching a movie when I got this weird feeling. It felt like something was watching me from the bedroom door. I had left the door open for my cat to come in and out, and as I turned to look at the doorway, I couldn't see much as the hallway was really dark beyond it. But I saw what looked like a large shadowy figure moving away from the door. I thought maybe it was just the dark hallway playing tricks on my eyes, but seconds later I heard the sound of something down the hallway. It sounded like something had fallen onto the floor and had broken. I was so terrified that I didn't even want to move or go look to see what it was. So instead, I turned the TV to the Disney Channel, hoping that it would put me at ease. When I woke up the next morning and walked down the hallway to use the bathroom, I saw what had caused the sound. My mother's favorite mirror that hung in the hallway was now shattered on the floor. When my parents got back home, I tried to explain what had happened, but neither of them believed me, and instead I got blamed for breaking my mother's mirror. And even though they never believed me, I know the truth about what happened. Whatever I felt watching me in the dark hallway that night had broken it. I had just graduated college back in 2017. I was struggling to find a cheap apartment in the area. A few friends of mine and I eventually decided that it would be best to get a place together and split the rent so that it was easier for all of us. There was 4 of us living on the main floor, and we had a basement that no one was staying in, so we eventually posted the basement as available to rent. Not long after, another guy who none of us knew ended up renting it from us. We all thought he was a bit odd, but it didn't really matter to us as it was extra money. We rarely saw him, and he never said much to us. The most I knew about the guy was that he liked to game a lot, and that he smoked quite a bit. Every night I could hear him below me having coughing fits. He didn't stay for long, I'd probably say a few months at most. He didn't even tell me that he was going to be leaving. I just noticed that one day I no longer heard him downstairs. Me and one of my friends who lived upstairs with me decided to go down to the basement with me to check if he had moved out. However, nothing could have prepared us for the state of the basement and how they had left it. The basement had a lot of mold, which made the air down there harder to breathe. Maybe that's why I heard the guy coughing all the time. Either that or what he was smoking. I also noticed a small crawlspace door in the basement that I had never noticed when we first moved into the place. There wasn't much inside other than trash and broken furniture. I texted the guy that we had let stay in the basement and found out that he had left 2 weeks before this. This sent a chill down my spine, because for the 2 weeks that he had supposedly been gone, I could still hear his coughing below me. But he wasn't even there. I'm now convinced that the sounds I heard weren't from him the whole time. In 2016, I had just turned 19 and was living with my parents while I attended a local community college. My past relationship, which I had been in since high school, lasted a few years but eventually ended once he left for college in another state. For about a year after graduating high school, I decided to just focus on myself and figure out what I wanted to do with my life. After starting classes at the community college, I finally decided to put myself back out there again and start dating. I had matched with a guy and things were going well over text until we finally met in person weeks later. He was a lot different in person than I thought he would be, and I couldn't help but get weird vibes from the guy. There wasn't anything in particular about him that made me feel that way. It was just the feeling I got around him. Needless to say, I didn't see him again after that. And not to mention, I didn't feel that we connected all that much anyways. Weeks went by and I hadn't really thought about the guy much after that. Then one day, I had gotten home a little later in the evening after getting back from class. I did all the typical stuff that I usually do, like finishing up my work for class, watching some TV, and showering before bed. I eventually got tired and climbed into bed to sleep. I was woken up sometime during the night by the sound of rustling in my room. I had a cat, so it wasn't odd to hear rustling at night, as I just assumed it was my cat. However, I woke up again, a second time, by a similar sound. It sounded like it was coming from under my bed. This time, I called out to what I thought was my cat. Whenever I call my cat's name, she usually meows back at me, but I heard nothing. There was a small crack between my mattress and the bed frame, so I peered through it and saw what looked like a hairy arm underneath my bed. Without hesitation, I jumped out of bed and ran towards the door. As I ran to the door, I heard the sound of rustling again and shushing sounds coming from under the bed. Paused, and when the person under my bed spoke, I immediately recognized the voice as a guy I had gone on a date with weeks before. He told me he just wanted to get to know me and what I was like when I was alone. I was so creeped out by this and scared of what he might do, so I ran to my parents' room to tell them. By the time my parents went into my room and the police arrived, he had just left. I never saw him again ever, but I now have trouble dating random people, as I'm terrified of who I could be going on a date with, and every night I always check underneath my bed before going to sleep now because of him.